So what does all of this output mean from a multiple regression? Well, just like with the simple linear regression that we had earlier, we can go here to the p-value on the Anova and check whether or not the model itself was, whether it was significant. In other words, if you have information about about a student on these four variables, are you better at predicting their value on the outcome, in this case volunteering, than you would be without knowing their values on these four variables? And with the value being less than 0.05 there, we can assume that we do have some good knowledge. Then we go to look at effect size. This is statistical significance. We're next looking at practical significance, which would be our R squared, or even better, our adjusted R squared, this is talking about the effect size for the sample. This is essentially talking about the effect size for the population in general, which is what we really care about. So what percent of the variance in whether or not they volunteered can be predicted by what we know about these four variables. And here we see it's actually like half of 1%, 0.5%. So not a lot. So right away we're thinking, we do have a significant model, but it turns out that whether or not a student volunteers in their mid-20s doesn't seem to be predicted that much by these four variables. However, let's go ahead and look a little bit at the what we had on these four individually. So you can look over here at the p-values to see which ones were statistically significant predictors after controlling for the others. And here we can see our lowest p-value is the socioeconomic status. So the socioeconomic status is the best of these four predictors in terms of predicting how likely a student is to volunteer. And that could go either way, right? I mean, you could feasibly see that someone who came from a low socioeconomic status might have more sympathy for people who are struggling and might actually volunteer more than a wealthier student. Or it might be the case where a student from a higher socioeconomic status has the resources and doesn't need to work as much, perhaps has more time available to volunteer. There could be lots of reasons how it could go either way, and it does turn out to be about a 50-50. I mean, we're looking at a very close call in terms of the people coming from a low socioeconomic status and high socioeconomic status, whether or not they volunteered. We do have a statistically significant result, but not so big of a chance. Basically, this 0.036 means for every standard deviation higher in socioeconomic status, the student was 3.6% more likely to volunteer. Or, I just realized I'm not familiar with my outcome variable as I should. Okay, so I did a search in the codebook for my outcome variable there, and realized I really should have clarified this earlier. So in order to get here, they've already said that they did some unpaid volunteer work, and this was a follow-up question that asked them, what type of organizations have you done volunteer work with in the last 2 years? And this was a yes or no question when it's talking about a specific volunteer for food, shelter, or basic necessities. There could, of course, be many other types of volunteering. And this would have also given me my missing variables, which I was able to find out through other means. But it is important to notice that this was a yes/no variable, so that when I'm interpreting this output here, I do know that this is a 0 or 1 outcome variable, and so it really is every standard deviation that you increase in socioeconomic status. We have a 3.6% more likely chance that in their volunteer work they would have helped groups with the basic needs, the basic food, shelter, homelessness, that kind of stuff. We can also look at these were virtually nothing. I mean, this isn't bode necessarily well for math. For every point higher they scored on this standardized test, and I think this was out of 80, what do we see, 80 points or so, they have 0.1 less chance that they were helping someone in their volunteer work with basic food, shelter, necessities. Reading tests slightly higher, but these numbers are so low, it's essentially saying there's no practical significance, and in fact there's not even statistical significance on either of those, although the reading was a little close. Number of sports, again, the negative number here would say the more sports a student played in high school, the slightly less likely they were if they did volunteer work, the less likely they were to help people with basic necessities. How much so? It was about 1%. For every extra sport they played, about 1% less likely if they did volunteer work to help people with the basic needs. And again, wasn't statistically significant. We're talking about splitting hairs somewhat here. So my biggest takeaway from this is even the combination of all of these four things, knowing their math and reading performance, their socioeconomic background, and the number of sports they played in high school, you really do not get a good prediction on how likely a student was to get into food, shelter, basic needs. It'd be interesting to go back and do the same thing perhaps for religious beliefs or maybe race thing. You would have to recode race into a dichotomous variable, like with only two values, like black and not black, or white and not white. You couldn't just use race as it was. But it'd be interesting to see if you could predict a student's likelihood to volunteer much stronger than you could with these four variables by using other variables that are related to social welfare, for example. All right, so that's interpreting a multiple regression, essentially the same. Oh, one last thing, the regression line, just like we looked at earlier with a single regression, we would take, this would be our intercept, and then we would take this number as kind of like the slope times their value on this, then this number times the student's value on this number, and so on. When we add all of those up, we'd have the student's predicted likelihood of helping with basic needs in their volunteer work. So it would just be a slightly larger equation with each of these numbers attached to the value on this variable. And I think it may be worth actually just going through one example here. So let's calculate a specific value for, let's take the intercept here, and then we're going to take 0.001. Let's say on this standardized math test, a student got a 45, which I think was roughly the average. And then maybe a similar thing, on their English test. Put a multiplication in here. Okay, and then let's say that their socioeconomic status was a little lower. Let's say they were one standard deviation below the mean. So their socioeconomic status was maybe in the 15th, 16th percentile. So on the lower end there. And then sports, let's say that they played 3 sports in high school. So if we have a student like that who kind of average on their math and English scores, a little lower on the socioeconomic status, who played 3 sports, put all that in, we'd get a 15.3% chance that if they did volunteer work, they would have done volunteer work with basic necessity type things, food, shelter, that kind of thing, which would be a little lower than the norm. The normal here, if they had 0 on all of these things, there'd be a 17.1% chance that they would have volunteered. So just a little bit lower than normal likelihood of them volunteering with that particular type of volunteer work.